Good morning and welcome. My name is Anne Marie Kaufman. I'm the Pastoral Associate for Faith Formation here at Holy Trinity. But I'd like to thank Ashley Click, our Pastoral Associate for Social Justice, and our Green Team for hosting John Podesta this morning. So thank you and welcome. And I'm going to turn it over to our pastor, Father Kevin Gillespie, who will introduce John. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie, and welcome, especially Green Team members who really are walking the talk of this important journey that John is going to be speaking to. It is indeed a great honor for me to introduce a parishioner. And as you may know, he's an American political consultant who has served as senior advisor to President Biden for clean energy, innovation, and implementation since September 2022. John previously served as the White House Chief of Staff to President Bill Clinton from 1998 to 2001, and counselor to President Barack Obama from 2014 to 2015. Before that, John served in the Clinton administration as White House Staff Secretary from 1993 to 1995, and White House Deputy Chief of Staff for operations from 1997 to 1998. He is the former president and now chair and counselor of the Center of American Progress, a think tank here in D.C., as well as visiting professor of law school at the Georgetown University Law Center. John also was chairman of Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. Additionally, he was chairman of the Biden transition team. In his present role as senior advisor to President Biden, Podesta John oversees the disbursement of millions of dollars in clean energy tax credits and incentives authorized by the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Perhaps some of you, this will be talked about today and presently or in his questions. John is a parishioner, as I said, and has worked with Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good and Catholics United. He and his wife, Mary, she's a lawyer and very involved in Ignatian Volunteer Corps. They have 3 children, Megan, Maya, May, and Gabe, who is here today. It gives me then great pleasure. By the way, he's a great cook and a fabulous marathon runner. So that's where he gets all of his energy reduction. So it does give me great pleasure to introduce our parishioner and friend, John Podesta.
Well, good morning, everybody. And can you hear me? No. How about there? Does that work better? And let me join Father Kevin in thanking the Green Team for all the work that you've done. It started in 2019, really getting together to both do what you can with respect to finding efficiencies and guiding the church and the school towards a greener path, but also getting together and in knowledge and in solidarity and really trying to understand the climate crisis and making a difference in your own lives. I will reflect for a minute, on Laudato Si, the encyclical from the Holy Father, but I would just note that the last and lengthy and maybe most important chapter is on ecological education and spirituality. And I think the Green Team is and the people who are engaged with the effort to really both help the church, Holy Trinity, the school, the surrounding buildings, but also improve their own lives is really living out what the Holy Father really asked all of us to do, because the linkage between that personal action and spirituality is, I think, where he brought together his teachings about what was really going on in the world to a call to action for all of us to be part of that. I have a special treat for you today. I have brought along my deputy, Christina Costa, who is just back from the Vatican. And Christina and I have been partners at this for a really long time. We worked together at the Center for American Progress. Then she came with me to the Obama White House. We worked together in the campaign. And then when I went back to the White House for President Biden, she put together the program at the DNC in 2020. She wrote the platform on these topics. Did a stint at the State Department, and when I came back to work for President Biden, she came back with me. As I noted, she was just at the Pontifical Academy convenings that the Holy Father asked that they put together representing the United States. So she might have some reflections about what Pope Francis had to say at that meeting that she attended. And I hope you don't have too bad jet lag. This is the first time we've seen each other since she came back. But I want to just set the stage a little bit and reflect on the fact that just if you're thinking about what's going on in the world, climate change can get very big, very fast, very hard to understand. But if you just look at what's gone on just in the last couple of weeks, I'm just talking about the last couple of weeks. Torrential rains and landslides killed 228 people in Kenya. We just heard from Father O'Neill. 200,000 people were displaced there. Heavy rains killed more than 130 people in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Flooding in southern Brazil in the past few days killed 78 people, displaced more than 100,000. Flooding over last weekend near Fort Worth swept away a 4-year-old, left literally hundreds stranded. We saw the derecho in Houston, which has left over 1 million people without power, 7 people killed. Japan had an unprecedented heat wave, which set a number of records, some over 6 degrees Celsius, more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat wave records above the previous records. In the Philippines, 2 weeks ago, closed its schools for an entire week because of excessive heat. So that's climate change happening right now, every day, all across the world, affecting people's lives. Particularly the most marginalized, the poorest people, the people who have the least ability to cope with the effects of extreme weather are experiencing. They're on the front lines of this right now. It's a challenge of human security and obviously of caring for the planet. And I think that's what the Holy Father foresaw in 2015 when he wrote that encyclical. That was just in advance of the Paris climate talks. It was unclear at that point whether the world could come together and at least form a framework for continued action and to push every nation on Earth to try to deal with and cope with the effects that were really becoming ominous if you were looking at the science. But I think he really made that critical statement in a moment that helped really galvanize the world for action. So for many reasons, we're blessed that he is our Pope. But I think this is one. He used the term Laudato Si, borrowing an expression from his namesake, St. Francis of Assisi, who in a canticle talked about praise be for the Earth Mother who opens her arms to embrace us. It was all at risk. I think he saw that and called us to care for our common home, and particularly for the most vulnerable. I've had the occasion to sit with him, and I think what motivates him is obviously that concern for the least able to care for themselves. And so we, as Catholics, I think, have a profound love and support for his vision in this. I think President Biden has long been a champion of climate action, and now Christina and I have the privilege of working for him. He's long understood that this was a challenge, even before people really were even talking about it. He takes pride in the fact that he was the first United States senator to introduce a bill back in the 1980s on climate change. And he really embraced tackling the climate crisis as one of the great causes of his presidency. He, on day one after our previous president pulled the United States out of the Paris Agreement, President Biden and Vice President Harris put the United States back into the Paris Agreement. He appointed my friend and predecessor in the role I currently have, which is to deal with some of the international work as well, Senator John Kerry, former Secretary of State. That was a big deal at the time, to bring back a former Secretary of State to make him special climate envoy. And the Secretary was relentless in going around the world and trying to form agreement with other countries to move things forward, including the last Conference of Parties, the so-called COP28 in Dubai, which for the first time 192 countries signed up for the proposition that we need to transition away from fossil fuels if we're going to deal with the serious effects on climate change. He created a climate policy, the president created a climate policy office in the White House to guide the work of the whole of government. Every agency participates, and we have the great privilege of working with leaders across the cabinet who are passionate about doing the right thing in this space. And then, of course, he passed the largest investment in clean energy and climate change, not just in the history of the United States, but in the history of the world, the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's what the two of us work on every day. It's hard. It covers every sector that emits pollution into the air, not just power, but transportation, agriculture and forestry, buildings, industry, and it really, I think, is shaped to help communities that have often borne the brunt of, again, maybe sometimes you see the president in the back of the church. Maybe he's kind of listening to those homilies. I think he shaped that to make sure that the people who have often borne the brunt of climate pollution, industrial pollution, the people who have the least ability to cope with it, the people who have been victims of environmental justice have benefit from the investments that are being made. It's a private sector-led bill. It's the bulk of the resources are tax credits that are going to the private sector that can invest in new technology, in transitioning away from fossil fuels, in investing in clean technology. Since that bill passed, there's been a tremendous response from the private sector since the president came into office, and there's been over $400 billion of announced investments in the United States in both the manufacturing and deployment of clean technology. More than 270,000 jobs have been created. Again, I think driven by the policy, 75% of that investment is going to counties that are below the median wage in the United States. So people who've often, I think, really in our politics have felt like they were ignored, they were left out, their livelihoods were taken for granted. People in coal communities and in traditional fossil fuel communities are feeling the effect of this bill, or will feel the effect of this bill. And again, there are targeted investments that largely come through grants, many of which administered by HUD and EPA, that are investing $1 billion in affordable housing, $1.5 billion in planting trees to reduce the heat load in urban environments. $27 billion just announced that will serve as a source of lending to ensure that moderate and low-income people have access to the clean technologies that middle-class people and people who have more means have been able to access, whether that's heat pumps or induction stoves or rooftop solar, etc. So there's a lot, and we can probably go on, and I'm much better at talking about taxes and regulation than I am about reflecting on spirituality. But I'm happy to take questions about the bill or just what the general strategy is. Before I do that, though, I want to give Christina a chance to say a few words about having just come back from Rome and what that conclave was all about and what the Pope had to say.
Thanks, John, and thanks everyone for welcoming me. I just got back yesterday evening after 3 days in the Vatican. There was a really tremendous convening put together by the Pontifical Academies of both science and social science, who had collaborated with outside experts on a charter, essentially, calling for increased attention to building resilience to the effects of climate change, particularly in the global south. And we had 3 days of expert talks, of debate, of deliberation, but also on the second day, the chance to hear directly from the Holy Father who addressed the gathering. There were several prominent U.S. governors, as well as governors and mayors from around the world in attendance. California Governor Newsom, Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey, who was really fabulous, I have to say, and New York Governor Hochul all attended, all sort of spoke about the work that they are doing in their own states to build resilience, to do so in a way that is equitable and that cares for the poorest and most vulnerable populations in their states. The Holy Father reflected in his remarks that the 3 billion poorest people in the world, predominantly, of course, in the global south, are responsible for only a little less than 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are put into the atmosphere year after year today, but they suffer something like 75% of the effects, of the impacts, of the damage caused by rising global temperatures, owing in part to geography, but also in a much greater way to just decades of poverty and underinvestment and inequality in their societies. He also reflected that of the 46 least developed countries in the world, many of which are in Africa, they account for less than 1% of those emissions in the atmosphere, while the G20, which includes the world's wealthiest nations, including, of course, the United States, but also China, the European Union, Japan, Indonesia, account for 80% or greater. And while we in the United States have recognized, I think, for a long time with an unfortunate interregnum for about 4 years there, I would say. Our special global responsibility, our position of moral leadership in the world for addressing the climate crisis. We are no longer the world's largest emitter, but we are still, for now at least, the largest historical emitter in the world, and of course the largest economy. And so that is why President Biden, Vice President Harris, the entire Biden-Harris administration have put such an enormous emphasis on addressing climate change, both here in the United States, predominantly through the Inflation Reduction Act, which John and I spent all of our time implementing and making work, but also through our international agenda. And we had the chance, I had the chance to speak both in the sessions as well as on the sidelines about the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, or PREPARE, which is a major foreign policy initiative of the administration. It has flown under the radar, I would say, but hopefully not for much longer, which aims to help 500 million of the world's most vulnerable people. So out of that 3 billion to get to at least 500 million of them by the end of the decade, to build resilience, to help them adapt to the impacts of climate change, that no matter how quickly we move to cut our emissions, we can't avoid. And it's modeled on an initiative that actually began in the George W. Bush administration called PEPFAR, which many of you are probably more familiar with, which was an all-of-government, both public and private sector approach to really addressing the HIV/AIDS crisis for the world's most vulnerable. And that was an initiative that was not only bipartisan, but eventually I think really nonpartisan in nature, and that had incredible support from the American faith community across all faiths, and there was a Franciscan sister in attendance at the event who had previously worked outside of Chicago on PEPFAR, and she talked about how incredible it had been to come together from her community, from the Episcopal community, from even, she said, we were doing things with the evangelicals and no one had ever seen us do that before. But it helped to generate this huge amount of attention and support on Capitol Hill, this amount of support for the President's initiative. And we're seeing that beginning to happen, and hope to see more of that happen for Prepare as well, which focuses on things like climate-smart agriculture, more resilient seeds, helping smallhold farmers to increase their productivity in a way that helps them stay on their land and have more both ecological resilience but also economic resilience. And I would just say that starting a bit where it sounds like maybe you began this morning, we also met with, not only did we hear directly from the Holy Father, who emphasized the importance of education and of young people, but we had a bilateral meeting with essentially our Vatican counterparts as well, who work in the Vatican's foreign ministry, because they have a foreign ministry. And they emphasized as well that they expected, as we look ahead to the UN Conference of Parties at the end of this year, that that message of education and of the importance of centering young people throughout the world in addressing the climate crisis will be central to their work and to the message that they hope to bring to that gathering. And so we look forward to continuing to work with them on that effort as we all move forward to address this crisis together. So, and then we can just talk about tax credits all day, honestly. I should say, speaking of tax credits, though, before I turn back to John, I did take the opportunity. One very exciting thing in the Inflation Reduction Act, which both John and I are slightly obsessed with, is that for the first time ever, thanks to this law, entities like this parish that do not pay federal tax can actually access the same benefits a private sector business could long access for doing things like installing solar or batteries or buying electric vehicles or vans or buses or things of that nature. It's called direct pay. And I told the Vatican about it, and they were pretty confused, but hopefully they'll take the message. Hopefully they'll take the message and help the parishes across the United States take advantage of that opportunity. So thank you for welcoming me.
Questions, comments, advice? We can always use a little of that.
Please, no speeches, just questions.
I'll try to put my question.
I'm serious about the advice, though.
Yeah.
I'll try to put my question into the form of a question. How much forward momentum does the Reduction Act make so that we can't have, if a certain person gets in, we get out of Paris again, we try to dismantle, we have a lot of opposition, like in Florida, this kind of thing. So just how much structurally can this move us forward?
Yeah, that's probably that's the question I'm most asked by the press, which can this survive November? And if politics goes sideways on us. And my answer to that is I think the Inflation Reduction Act, and again, we're both veterans of the Affordable Care Act. The Inflation Reduction Act has deep roots. That $400 billion of investment that I noted, nearly $180 billion in battery and EV supply chains, tens of billions of dollars in solar manufacturing, $100 billion in deployment. Those are very, very hard to uproot. I mean, those are plants being built. We have the highest level ever recorded of construction of new plants, manufacturing plants in the U.S. That's because of the trio of bills that the president passed, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Those things are really happening. People are going to work. We have tremendous, and that's across the board. It's particularly maybe overweighted into red districts and red states. Very, very hard to reverse that. Jim Slattery's here. He'll correct me if I'm wrong, former member of Congress. But I think that the rest of the climate agenda is on the ballot. So in addition to the investments that I've been talking about, we've had an extremely aggressive agenda of setting rules of the road, trying to reduce, some people call that regulation, using the Clean Air Act to set standards in the power sector, in the car and light-duty truck sector, in the heavy-duty truck sector, control of methane from oil and gas leakage. We instituted the first fee on essentially fugitive methane from oil and gas. Those things, along with the global leadership, the fact that the United States really now leads the global conversation on climate change through the COP. Those are all at stake. And so people will get a chance to decide which direction they want to go in. But I think the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act are pretty secure. That's the one component that and again, I harken back to the Affordable Care Act. After you've signed 20 million people up for health care, it's hard to rip that away, as the opponents of the bill found. And so it's kind of a mixed bag, but I think we'll have time to discuss that. We can't do politics from where we used to do politics, but we don't do it anymore. But I don't know, more than anything.
I would just underscore that it was clear at this gathering that the world is extremely nervous after what happened last time, and that John's. I completely agree that there's just a huge cadre of private sector entities that have a huge incentive to go to Congress and say, "Don't take it away. We know that the last guy did it, but don't take it away." But all of our regulatory agenda, but also our ability to do things like prepare. The initiative, or to invest in resilient infrastructure, direct our federal aid, our foreign aid dollars to building clean energy projects rather than building fossil fuel projects in the developing world, will just all go away. The former president's first Secretary of State was the CEO of ExxonMobil, and he was amazingly not the worst cabinet appointment that they made. She says in a totally nonpartisan manner. So just, that is clearly where they would head again, and with greater gusto.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Brand, and I come here from Blessed Sacrament Parish. Can you hear me okay? I just want to say I'm a retired principal, recently relocated here 5 years ago, in time for the former president's administration, and couldn't have been more liberated by being present in Washington, D.C., and a part of a parish that was practicing care for creation, and a part of Mom's Clean Air Force. That's Mom's Clean Air Force, very active, very good. See, they're downtown in red shirts. I don't think I would have personally survived that administration for all the frustration they caused me over the environment. And coming out of the West Coast in Seattle in particular, it was real painful. Anyway, I just want to encourage every person here, if we have to go through another 4 years, that go to the EPA, stand up and speak. It's nice to hear the global efforts, but I need to feel like I'm doing my bit too. I have 2 grandchildren.
Here. Well, one of the things that was stimulated by leaving Paris was the We're Still In movement. It started at the governor's level with Christina mentioned Governor Newsom and Governor Hochul. Their predecessors, Governor Cuomo and Governor Brown, created the U.S. Climate Alliance, which were 26 governors who said, we're going to still meet the commitments that President Obama made in the context of Paris. That produce action at the state and local level. Mike Bloomberg was sort of a hero in that effort in providing resources to make sure that the subnational level, the business community, and particularly nonprofits and just regular citizens who said we want to do our piece had some resources available to make sure the country actually, even during, with the policy pulling in the opposite direction, the states were going forward, and you see the results of that in the amazing emissions reductions that places like California have been able to achieve. But it's happened in what one would think of as less clearly kind of liberal states like New Mexico and Illinois and other places around the country.
Hi, Lonnie Ellis, and my question is about the U.S. faith community. First, I do want to thank you, John, for arranging at fairly short notice the White House visit with 3 bishops and a sister and myself. That was after Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation came out, and we wanted to get in a short notice, but you made it happen. Thanks for that. How is the faith community doing right now? Following up on what Pope Francis is doing in terms of both advocacy and solar on congregations, is that happening at a decent rate?
I think in terms of, I was just talking to representatives of Network and who have just added a full-time climate lobbyist, and I think that that's beginning really to be felt by people on Capitol Hill and in capitals across the country. In terms of what they're doing in their own congregations, Christina did a great job of talking about this this is really kind of revolutionary to give nonprofits the ability to take advantage of things that previously only private sector companies could take advantage of. The other thing I wanted to say, and it triggers from what she was saying, one of the real key advantages of this bill is there's 10 years of certainty in it. So we had been in a place where it was on, off. Sometimes you had a tax credit, sometimes you didn't. You never knew whether it was going to happen next year. The fact that these are, for the most part, 10 years long gives people the ability to plan and have a long runway to get those projects built. So that's a very important part of the law. With respect to this feature involving nonprofits, I think people are just finding out about it. We're trying to work with, we've stimulated more than $2 billion of philanthropic support to get the word out, if you will. There's a broad group of foundations that have pledged to go to 500 communities and build 1,500 projects that are really working in this space with nonprofits, with churches, with other. A lot of times you think of nonprofits as kind of struggling 2 or 3 person operations. There are also like massive hospitals that are organized as nonprofits who now can take advantage of these of the support for pushing towards changing the way we produce and consume energy. So I think this can be a very powerful driver, but it's really at the early stages. I know that I noted that the Green Team's been active since 2019, but this gives a whole new ability to get, if you want to do projects and to work with sister congregations to build projects that the federal government can literally, if you build it, put it in service, the federal government can write a check for 30, 40, 50, sometimes 60%, if depending on taking advantage of bonuses that come from siting in disadvantaged communities or definitely using paying prevailing wage and using certified apprentices on the projects. So there's social policy also built in to the formation of this. But I think we're just seeing this beginning to, people understanding it and beginning to take off. We saw a couple of the capital planners from the city of Los Angeles were in the office the other day, and this opened a whole new world about how municipalities do their capital budgeting, because these resources are now available to cities and states as well as nonprofits.
Yes, I'm Phil Downey. Thank you for being here. Is carbon taxation, putting a price on carbon, is that part of the policy conversation right now in the administration? And I guess for Christina, it seems to be getting more traction globally. You might have heard more about that at your recent Vatican conference, but I'm just wondering what your perspective is on that.
I think, in the U.S., carbon pricing or carbon taxing has been we have some of it, mostly in the Northeast and in California. It's never gotten much traction at the federal level. We tried to put a so-called cap and trade, which is a carbon pricing scheme, in place in 2009. It passed the House and failed in the Senate. I think one of the reasons that the policy was developed the way it was to reflect the fact that you can have the perfect policy, but if you can't get it enacted, you're not going to get very many emissions reductions. So that was something of a reality. There are two places where carbon pricing is sort of in the conversation. One, as I mentioned, on methane. There is a pricing scheme now to reduce methane particularly in the oil and gas emission sector. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, 20 times more powerful than CO2. And it's shorter lived, so getting it out now is really critical. And the other place that this is now starting to come up is in the conversation around trading and tradable goods. So Europe is imposing carbon border adjustment based on their carbon pricing scheme, and the world's beginning to react to that. Canada's thinking about the same thing. We're opened up a conversation with people on Capitol Hill about how do we blend our system with theirs if the embodied carbon in tradable goods, think steel, cement, glass, you got to get those basic industrial commodities made in the lowest emitting way possible. You have to have a race to the top in that regard, and that's kind of opened up a conversation about pricing. But all my economist friends who tell me that it's much more efficient to just have a carbon tax, I said, well, tell me show me it's more efficient to count the votes that will vote in favor of carbon, and then we can have that conversation. Go on, talk about the voting.
Yeah, so actually, I would say that at the conference, it was the trade conversation that was the predominant what you would think of as a carbon pricing conversation. I think that is because, as John notes, the EU isn't going in that direction. It's because we've opened the door. It's because the Canadians are looking at it. But it's also because it more thoroughly accounts for the fact that it doesn't help the atmosphere if you just move emissions from one country to another. If you move some high emitting sector from the United States, where we're making enormous progress in reducing our emissions, our primary emissions, to a country that has less stringent policies, that has less reliable regulatory apparatus, whose emissions are actually increasing, and regardless of the reason you do it, that the atmosphere doesn't actually care where the emissions come from, right? And so looking at how to incorporate climate considerations and emissions considerations into the global trading scheme, and doing it in a way that provides for the full and equitable participation of developing countries, so that you don't end up with a bifurcated trading system, because that also won't help the climate, and it also won't help human development either, is I think where the conversation is going, and going actually in a right now bipartisan way on the Hill. There are some Republican members who have introduced legislation both in the House and the Senate on carbon trading, on accounting for carbon in international trade, which is an interesting development.
Good morning, and thank you both, John and Christine, for coming out today on Sunday morning. We appreciate that. And we also appreciate all your efforts in getting the bill passed, because it's a tremendous advance in public policy. But you know, if I were a fly on the wall in the White House, I would be really interested in hearing what's going on in terms of issues that are sensitive politically, that you can't really talk about publicly. But you're among friends.
It's all off the record.
Right. And I'm just wondering if you ever talk about growth as a fundamental problem. That a steady state economy, degrowth, is ultimately something that we will have to grapple with, because we cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. And I'm just wondering if that ever comes up in your conversations, if it's something possibly that could be broached in the second term, or if that's just, we can't go there.
Well, I think it comes up a lot, actually. But I think maybe not from the perspective that you're describing. I want to come back to what the Holy Father has written about that. The kind of culture of consumption and waste has to be tackled and brought to bear, and people have to make that a sort of both in their own lives, but also in policy, has to be, when we need to reduce the consumption of things, reuse them, recycle them. We don't have an infinite dumping ground on the planet, and the other global environmental problems are, I think, highly accelerated by climate change, but they're not just climate change. They're we're in an international negotiation right now around a plastic treaty. There's strains on biodiversity that come from development, not just from the warming planet. They're obviously made all that much worse by the warming planet. So the question is what kind of. On the other hand, I think the need to give people good livelihoods is ever present. I was, and Christina and I both worked on this when we were at CAP. We worked on the first draft of the Sustainable Development Goals as an exercise that was organized by a high-level panel that I participated on, that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon did. And even there, in its reflection on a full suite of policies, I guess, or goals that support ending global poverty or ending extreme poverty and bringing people up. I mean, I think this idea that you needed to produce jobs, you needed to produce investment was still present. So the question is, what growth model are you applying, and can you create, and particularly in this context, can you create the ability to set the right sort of incentives to move away from fossil fuels and towards clean forms of energy generation that will produce a growth pattern that is more sustainable globally? And so I think the combination of trying to think about it that way, plus trying to, which is largely a matter of public education, which is, again, why I think Laudato Si was so important, but what are we doing? How are we experiencing the world? What changes can we make to whether that's a technical level of putting solar on your rooftop, or at a personal level in terms of the way you're trying to reduce your own footprint on the planet and take account of all living things on the planet that rely on the ability to move forward. I guess that's the way we talk about it, but yes, we talk about growth all the time. And sustainable growth, I think. And I'm not sure every one of our policies is one could defend on that basis, but I think because sometimes you need to do things for one reason or another, but I think in general terms that we're trying to aim in that direction.
Those of us on the Green Team, I think I could say we all greatly appreciate you being here and the work that you're doing, and especially joining us today. But my question has to do with some of us were you mentioned the plastic treaty. Some of us were in Ottawa at the recent UN meeting on ending plastic pollution. And I wonder if you could share your understanding of how the U.S. national plan to end plastic pollution can contribute to reducing greenhouse gases.
Well, I think that first of all we need to get our own cut. In my view, and we're in discussions about this. We just had the 4th of 5 or 5th of 6. I'm not sure which. I can't remember which negotiations, but culminating in what is intended to be a final negotiations on a global plastics treaty next fall. And I think we need to move our ambition up in this regard, both in terms of what happens to plastic once it's made and put into the economy. And there's a huge, we could do another session just on plastic, but as well as how much plastic needs to be produced, how it's being produced, what's the effect of the actual production. It's made with hydrocarbons, etc. I think in the long term, the sort of cleaning up both the production and disposal side are going to be important potential drivers of greenhouse gas reduction. The other place where plastic ends up in the oceans, it ends up in the river, it ends up in our gut, it ends up in our bloodstream. It ends up in our reproductive organs. It's bad, it's like this is a big problem. But it also ends up in landfills, and we need to do a better job of overall of reducing waste and particularly reducing methane from landfills, which is a very important contributor to greenhouse gases.
Good morning, Mike Cantwell. Could you talk a little bit about some of the effects on rural communities, extraction communities, and how to mitigate the policy changes to ensure they have high quality of life and opportunity in those communities? And then is there something that parishes like Holy Trinity could do to partner with some of these rural parishes in West Virginia and other places?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that's been really central to the President's thinking about how to address the clean energy transition really since the beginning of this term. He created an interagency working group on, let me see if I can do this, coal and power plant communities and economic revitalization. It's really catchy. But what that means is that we have a really robust interagency effort with the Secretariat at the Department of Energy that identified sort of the highest need, predominantly coal communities, coal regions in the United States, both coal producing and power plant regions, to have really an on-the-ground, direct, all of government engagement with local leaders in those places to identify okay, what is your economic development strategy? How can we support it? What do you need? And it varies from place to place, right? In Wyoming, their greatest need is housing and assistance in building housing, because actually they have a lot of jobs coming to the area. But it is, and they have jobs outside, they have a lot of clean energy jobs coming to the area, because Wyoming has enormous potential for wind and for solar, and they are investing in those areas. But it's driving up their local housing prices, and that's creating problems for the community. And so that is an area where the federal government is working to support the governor of Wyoming and local communities in Wyoming to make those investments in, in Appalachia, in West Virginia, in Ohio, in the Ohio River Valley. It is much more still about needing to reinvest in a hollowed out industrial base where we have a lot of programs and tax incentives and other things doing that. And it's really about helping those communities identify what stack of initiatives they need to compete for, or to leverage from the federal government to get those jobs back to their communities, so that people don't feel like they have to leave in order to find economic opportunity. Within the IRA, on the tax credits that we will just never stop talking to you about, there's a 10% bonus credit for building clean energy projects in energy communities, and that includes both coal communities as well as other fossil fuel communities, as well as on brownfields. And so that is an incentive that hits both rural and urban communities to create incentives to invest in industrialized places that might not otherwise access that investment. I would say that a big opportunity would be to partner with parishes in Appalachia on direct pay, which we've talked about a few times, help them navigate those tools, help them access sort of the upfront capital that is needed to actually build the project so they can access the benefit on the back end. And then I think also just, one of the places that our philanthropic table has been focusing is just on job training and partnering with the labor unions, who still have enormous presence in the region, to get young people and middle-aged workers as well into apprenticeship programs and into job training programs for the jobs that will be coming back in the next years as a result of all of these investments. But it's an excellent question. We're doing a lot, but we can always do more.
I want to start by saying I really love the Inflation Reduction Act. It does a great job of putting together industrial and environmental policy. But one thing you guys talked about was how regulation could be affected by a different administration. But another thing that I was worrying about was the end of the Chevron deference. Do you guys have any ways that even if you guys do get reelected, you can support protecting the Chevron deference or supporting the stuff that works within it?
You are a lawyer, or a budding lawyer, I guess. Chevron was a Supreme Court case that was settled and everyone thought was decided law back in maybe
82.
82. And which deferred to agency expertise in interpreting what are sometimes vague statutes or statutes that need further explication. Clean Air Act is a wonderful example of that. And the current majority on the Supreme Court is a little bit on a tearing down some of those precedents. They upheld the ability to regulate under the Clean Air Act in a case called West Virginia versus EPA. But this issue of whether the court should be deferential to agencies' interpretation of what their authority is to go ahead and regulate in these areas. This particularly affects EPA, but it affects really the whole regulatory state, is in front of the court now and will be decided this term.
Hi, with everything going on, I just wanted to ask what gives you hope?
Should I do my AI answer?
Yeah, sure. Do it.
Well, I sometimes get people's heads to snap to say that, well, I'm hopeful that climate change won't cause the extinction of the human race because we're racing AI for that. But
seriously.
well, I think the work gives me hope. The fact that that if you even if you can make a little bit of difference every day, it builds on itself, and that's itself a kind of puts you in community with other people who are trying to tackle a massive global problem. And again, we both had the honor of being able to not just work in the White House and represent the president, but work across the globe where people with, I was just thinking about Father O'Neill, who said Mass this morning in the church, and the work he's doing in refugee camps in Kenya. And just the fact that you can make a little bit of difference for some people's lives on a daily basis, that's what gives me hope and gives me pleasure, I guess. Gives me happiness. Let's put it that way. You have a better answer?
I don't know if I have a better answer, but I would say that I agree that the work gives me hope. The ability still to make progress in these areas, sometimes against massive odds, gives me hope. Ann Richards, who was the this is also a little twisted, but I think it works. Ann Richards, who was the first woman to be governor of Texas, used to say, people don't do things for your reasons, they do things for their reasons. And so what has been fascinating in doing Inflation Reduction Act implementation is that we have a lot of really odd bedfellows, but who are actually all rowing in the same direction, because they have their own reasons for doing it. But as long as we're getting the boat down the river, I don't care what's motivating them to row the oar.
I'm Matt. I have one question, is how are you strengthening the power grid? First, as we try to electrify the future, how are we going to make sure the grid is reliable, resilient with all the climate change, all the initiatives that are going on?
Sure. So we're doing a lot with the power sector, with the power grid. It is an enormous challenge for us. One of the weird things about implementing the Inflation Reduction Act is that we work a lot with our friends at the Department of Treasury because they are in charge of the tax code, but they are not energy experts, which they will be the first ones to admit. And so I like to tell them that the U.S. doesn't have a power grid so much as we have a bunch of cats in a sack that somehow keep the lights on. And we need to have that change. We need a more sort of integrated grid with greater transmission, with greater redundancies, with greater ability to move power from one place to another to cope with these extreme weather events. I do think that increases in having more distributed power and more microgrids help enormously with building resilience, with coping with extreme weather events. But we do also need greater big transmission infrastructure and efforts to be able to move more power on the grid that we already have. FERC finalized some rules that should help with that. Should help with that. They finalized them last week, I think. But that is an area where we are focusing a lot of attention. The utilities are focusing a lot of attention. The many regulatory bodies that have a say in this are focusing a lot of attention. But I would not say that it is a thing that we were given sort of a silver bullet to deal with in the Inflation Reduction Act, and so that is going to continue to be a really important piece of work in the years to come.
Good morning. Wow, that's very loud. A moment ago, you were talking about how Network Lobby recently hired a climate lobbyist. Well, that is me. So it is very nice to meet you both. My name is Drake Starling, and I was wondering, for Biden's second term, which, fingers crossed, the climate provisions that were in Build Back Better, is that something that is currently being discussed about being attempted to be passed in his second term, if not the whole bill itself, which would be wonderful as well?
Well, one of the biggest things that was left on the cutting room floor was the American Climate Corps. And we found a way to, and I think that was a very important thing to be doing. It got, for like lots of backstories on that, but it didn't make the final cut but we still found a way to put it together with a hub at AmeriCorps, but with a number of at least the land and agencies and natural resource agencies participating in putting young people to work in service of dealing with resilience and mitigation in the climate sector. So we have the first 2,000 job openings posted for that. The president has put money into the fiscal year 25 budget to move forward with that. And with the hopes of moving that to over some period of time to 100,000, mostly young Americans. You don't have to be young. I'm a veteran of, I worked at an agency which was then called Action, which is sort of the Corporation for National National and Community Service, which had the Peace Corps and Vista and the Senior Volunteer Program. So, well, you know, I think this is particularly the American Climate Corps is attractive to young people, but anybody who wants to serve in their community and take one of these stipended volunteer slots is open to do it. So that was a big thing that got left out and is moving forward. I think there are other provisions that we would like to see, and I think we have to tackle in a second term this question we've sort of made reference to, which is what do you do about carbon dumping, tradable goods, the fact that you can't give advantage to people and which our current trading system sort of does to people who pollute more as their comparative advantage in the world global trading system. You know, we've got to reverse that and try to move the world to cleaner development, particularly of industrial goods. So that's a big, huge challenge for a second term. And then we just got to, go faster. We're probably, I think the Inflation Reduction Act alone cuts our emissions by probably around 42%. President's pledged 50%. The rules that I talked about on power plants and cars, that gets us a little further. But this is going to be a challenge for generations and generations to get to the point where we're taking as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we're putting into it. People toss around this term net zero. That's what net zero means. We're removing as much carbon as we're putting into it. A lot of that has to do with better balance in the natural world, ending deforestation, reforesting places where we can, using the ocean in a way that's not just a dumping ground, but providing carbon services. But, this is going to be, particularly for the young people in the audience, if you want a long career, this is a good one to be in. Because we're going to be at this for a long time trying to deal with 2 centuries of industrialization that didn't take account of what we were doing to our planet. And we're going to have to stop that, move forward, and then reverse those effects.
Good morning. My name is Khulud. I work in the Climate Investment Fund. And over the last few years, the G20 and G7, along with the Prime Minister Mia Mottley, has been really challenging the aid architecture with a focus of the multilateral development banks to do more, to do better, particularly on climate change. And given that among the main multilateral climate funds, only the Climate Investment Fund, as you know, particularly focus on strengthening these MDBs and making them work as a system using a proven demand-driven programmatic model backing even by scientific community, including Dr. Jane Goodall, and has yet transformational results. So my question, why, if we are in a crisis, is the US government sticking to strict lanes of division and not focusing its effort and budget on a vehicle that's working and mobilizing private capital in this fight? Thank you.
Well, I reject the premise. The first thing that happened was we got new leadership, both in the Green Climate Fund and particularly most importantly at the World Bank. Ajay Banga, who's the new president of the World Bank, has completely changed both the goals of the bank and the focus of the bank, and increased from 25% of the bank's lending in this climate mitigation and adaptation space to 45%, with half going to adaptation that we talked about. The U.S. has been, Secretary Yellen in particular, has been forceful in talking about development bank in international financial institution evolution. That's a fancy name for reform. They need to do a better job. They need to use their balance sheets more forwardly. The whole debate around the next COP is really around how the developed world can support a financial system that's going to unlock private sector flows into the developing world. It has a fancy name. It's called NCQG. I don't even know. I think I'm in charge of it, but I don't even know.
New
collective quantified goal.
Something.
So there's a lot of debate about how we do exactly what you're suggesting, but I think the United States is now in the position where we're a positive actor and trying to ensure that we have high standards, that we're dealing with the debt. We have one of the real huge problems for those of you who are concerned really about the poorest people in the world. There are now outflows of capital from the least developed economies that are going to debt service rather than providing the kind of services that are needed. That's a kind of post-COVID phenomena. So we need to do something about that, and trying to come up with instruments for debt for nature swaps and other things that will be helpful. So I think the United States is actually leaning into the problem.
It's now after 11:15, so those of you who need to go to 11:30 Mass, Father Kevin, you want to say something? One more question. I have one over here. This gentleman's been very patient.
Good morning. My question is as follows. You're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. Are there any other big packages that you may have perhaps in your presentation perhaps would like to mention, such as the bilateral infrastructure bill that also helps in that direction? Is that sort of a sister of that, or would you mind explaining that for us, please?
Yeah, the bipartisan infrastructure law passed a year earlier. It contained a significant amount of money to do clean energy demonstrations. So you may have seen or heard reference to, particularly in the industrial sector, there's a lot of money coming from the federal government in the form of grants to specific projects, specific companies to demonstrate new technology. The hydrogen hubs, there's a lot of buzz about hydrogen these days, which is going to be critical, are built out of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And the CHIPS and Science Act provided a significant amount of funding, largely directed at rebuilding the domestic chip industry, but that has huge impact in the energy sector, both in terms of the way of reducing, creating more efficiency, reducing energy usage, but it also just in general builds on that ecosystem of innovation that's going to be really critical in the clean energy space. I think we're kind of done.
I think we'll have to have you come down.
I was going to leave them with Pope Francis. Okay, so I think it's fitting, since we've been talking about Laudato Si. The Holy Father ended that with two prayers, and I'm going to close with a prayer, which he provided to all of us. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth. So precious in your eyes, bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Thank you. Amen.
Thank you. You're really voices of hope on this Pentecost day. The Spirit is alive in what you've given, not just in spiritual, but the practical. A very Ignatian, I must say. But I also, again, want to affirm the work of the Green Team and all the energies that we're waiting anxiously for the diocese to give us the green light to put solar panels on these roofs right up here. So we're moving. But I know some of you are rushing to Mass, that if you want to stay and maybe have a few minutes to ask some questions. So thank you all. Enjoy the feast, and let's protect our common good.
Sure.